From the emails. Welcome everybody. As you'll know from the emails, we're setting up a whole lecture series on entrepreneurship for the AgriFoRwArdS CDT, and we've got 3 sessions set up before Christmas. And what we'd like you to do is really give us feedback on those, and then that can inform the sessions that we set up after Christmas. So you should have got 3 dates for now, and then we'll resume again in February based on the feedback you give on the sessions that we have. So today Brian and Alex are giving a talk about setting up a business and raising funding and all of the nuts and bolts of the things you need to do. The second session is an actual agri-tech startup CEO from a company called the Small Robot Company, which are doing per plant agriculture. So that's very exciting. And then the third workshop before Christmas is a very hands-on workshop to practice doing a pitch and pitching an idea. Brilliant. Thank you. I'll hand over to Alex and Brian now. Thank you.
Yep. Let me kick off. Brian, do you want to introduce yourself later?
Yeah, shall I introduce myself after you do now, right? And then I can just go into the lecture later on, just get the kind of intros out the way at the beginning, I guess.
That's fine. I think I'm sharing my screen.
You are indeed.
I won't elaborate on myself. I'm Alex. I'm a self-employed kind of consultant in the area of commercialization. And for part of that, I'm an associate of Cambridge Enterprise, helping them to engage with universities from all over the world that want to learn how to commercialize their research results. Brian, a very similar person.
Indeed. So yeah, I do exactly the same as Alex in terms of Cambridge Enterprise. We've been working together for 10 years now. Outside of that, I've been working in technology commercialization for around about 40 years, and included in that has been numerous startups in various formats, either as an employee, a founder, CEO, whatever. So been through the mill a few times, and hopefully today I can pass on a few bits of feedback from that process.
Yep. And my background is technical, although not agri-tech, it's material science. Brian's is not technical. And
not at all.
It's not a hindrance at all. Anyone can do this. In fact, my very first slide is to tell you that none of this is rocket science. Everything that we're going to cover is really quite easy to understand. It makes a lot of sense. It's straightforward. There are just some pitfalls to be aware of. There's kind of some systematic steps to go through if you want to maximize your chance of success. But I'm sure all of you will be perfectly capable of understanding everything that we talk about. The other bit of good news is that you will get a copy of the slides, so please don't feel that you have to make lots of notes throughout. You can focus on what we actually say and then hopefully come up with some really good questions. I'm kind of interested to have a feel for what you are hoping to achieve with all of this, but I don't know if my chat box seems to have disappeared. Can I get the chat open again? Would anyone like to share with them what you're trying to get out of all of this? Are you here because you have an idea for a new business? Are you here because you just want to know more in general terms what this involves? Have you already got a business, perhaps? Would anyone like to type in the chat what your motivation is for being here today? I'm not seeing any responses at the moment. Yeah, broaden knowledge, okay. General knowledge, options for commercial, end of PhD, yeah, good moment to think about it. Actually, during your PhD, you might want to think about it. Any others? Perspectives, real world ways, yeah. Technology-enabled ventures, good. Yep. Yeah, funding sources, always a popular subject. You've got a business, okay. VCs, ooh. I'll have a few things to say about VCs. Okay, let's move on. Thank you. It sounds as if you're all in the right place, so that's always encouraging. The way I'd like to start this is really by making a distinction between two types of businesses. There's what you might call the traditional business, the sort of chip shop, hairdresser, furniture maker, and those are just random examples of the kind of business that people set up on a daily basis. And by contrast, the agritech or any tech-enabled business, that picture, I don't think it's from the small robot company, but it does seem to be a small robot picking some weird hybrid between apples and strawberries. And would anyone like to share what the big difference is, the essential difference between these categories? Again, in the chat box, if you'd like to come up with some ideas of what, it's not necessarily a fundamental difference, but it is very significant. Any thoughts? Barrier to entry? Could be, yeah. Growth potential, B2C, maybe. Okay, yeah. I think we're getting a little, that's Stephen. Stephen, that's cheating. You're a mentor, you're not a student. Okay, let's move on. My take on this is really that the big difference between these categories is the risk, the level of risk and the type of risk that you run. Any business, any new business that you start has a degree of commercial risk. There's always a chance that you start the business and you then discover that the market actually doesn't want what you're offering them to the degree that you were hoping for, to a high enough degree that they will pay enough money for you to have a sustainable business. That can be the case with a new chip shop or a furniture maker or a hairdresser, just as much as with a commercial venture. But if you're starting a new venture that is enabled by new technology, then there are two aspects to risk that are significantly higher. I would argue the commercial risk is higher because you will be introducing something to the market that is in itself novel. And the question is, will the market accept this? You know, you can generally assume that the market will accept a chip shop or a hairdresser because people know what it is, they're familiar with it, they know what to expect, and in principle there is likely to be demand. You may cite it in the wrong place, there may be too strong competition, you may be really bad at hairdressing, okay, but in principle it's something that the market will accept. If you're coming up with something that's entirely new to the market that does things that couldn't previously be done, you run the risk that the market will turn around and say, this is too new, this is too different, I don't really want this. So there is higher commercial risk. And very closely related to that is the technological risk itself, which is the risk that you've come up with something that may be very exciting in the lab or in a workshop, but you cannot turn into a practical product that functions well enough for the market to accept it, for it to offer the benefits that you would like to offer the market. Technological risk is a very particular category that doesn't really exist in the case of the chip shop model. And you will therefore need to pay extra attention to making sure that you manage those risks and that you start to reduce those risks to a level where the overall risk of taking the step of starting a new venture and putting it in the market becomes manageable, becomes acceptable. To approach that, don't do what these guys did. Don't just steam rapidly ahead in the hope that you'll push aside any icebergs, or won't bump into any icebergs in particular. There is some care and attention to be paid here, and there are some processes to follow. The first one is, in order to reduce your commercial risk, you've got to do some things that sound really obvious, but people often underestimate. And that is, first of all, identify that there is some kind of problem out there that your technology can help solve. Don't just assume that that exists, and don't just assume that you know who will be buying this from you, you've got to go and test this in the market. And we'll come back to how exactly you can do this. But when you're trying to introduce something new to the market, you've got to make sure that there is somebody out there who wants to buy it, that you know who it is, and that you know why they want to buy it, and that they agree. And that commercial risk is really quite significant. At the same time, it is generally sensible to do some technical work to develop your idea to the point where it can work in real life practical circumstances, even if those circumstances are initially simulated. Don't just expect people to start pushing money towards you if all you have is something that works in a laboratory or in a workshop environment, in an improvised situation. Try to develop prototypes, try to develop something that you can show to people and that offers the kind of performance that will get people excited. And you really need to try and reduce these two types of risks in parallel. That brings me to this little slogan, which I've stolen. I'm probably breaching copyright here because I've taken it from this organization called Meta Academy. I subscribe to their newsletter. And in order to come to a solution that the market actually wants, you have to be careful that you don't just develop a solution that is looking for a problem, but that you first identify a problem and then see how you can develop a solution that actually addresses that problem. And you need to become quite fanatically obsessed with your customer, with how your customer experiences the world, what gets them up in the morning, what keeps them up at night, what kind of problems do they have. And only when you have a good understanding of that can you come up with a sensible solution. It may be that your initial idea is exactly that solution, or it may be that it needs to be modified, or it may be that you have to do something different altogether. It's quite possible that you find yourself in that situation. What you don't want to do is spend a lot of time and effort developing a solution and then finding that actually that is not the thing that your market wants. So you've got to try to get to the point where you know what your market wants at the earliest possible opportunity. And in order to do that, this is my 5-word version of this whole talk. If I only had 5 words of guidance to give you, then these would be they. Let the market guide you. Ultimately, the market consists of individuals who have to make the buying decisions, who have to decide that they want your product or your process or your system or your service, and have to be prepared to pay money for that. And in order to get you to the point where this happens, you have to let them guide you right from the start. Otherwise, you run a serious risk of going in the wrong direction. And in many ways, this is like a scientific research process. You've got to form some hypotheses, first of all. So in this case, for example, we've got a technology. This can be used to develop a solution that looks like this, and that solves a problem that looks like that. And the problem holder is a company or an individual that looks like this. And you've got to be able to formulate this to start with. And then you've got to understand how your customer actually wants to receive the benefit of your innovation. Do they want it in the form of a product that they buy? Do they want it in the form of perhaps a more holistic system that integrates with what they do already? Do they want to buy it in the form of a service that you deliver that is enabled by your product? Those are very important distinctions. And there are plenty of case studies of businesses that made the wrong decision at the start, spent a lot of time and effort and money developing, for example, a product, only to discover that the market wanted to receive the benefit that the product can offer in the form of a service. So the company then had to reinvent itself as a service business. And it's much better to get this clear right from the start so that you don't waste a lot of time and effort and money going in the wrong direction. And you've got to test these hypotheses, and you do that through doing the right kind of market research. In essence, it's very similar to a scientific research process. what you will often find is that your initial hypothesis was wrong, and that's fine, and that is all part of the process. You just have to have the flexibility to modify our hypothesis, to change your plans if the market tells you that it wants something different from what you originally thought you were going to offer it. It's very important. On the one hand, you have to believe in your innovation and have the enthusiasm, and to a degree be stubborn. On the other hand, you do have to listen to the market. So find that balance between those two. The kinds of market research you should do in the first instance, you would normally do secondary market research, which means you're using pre-existing sources of information, typically via the internet, articles, pieces of market research that people have done in the past, market research reports, written information. And you do that to form an image of the market that you have in mind. You begin to understand it, how big it is, how it is structured, what kind of trends are happening within it, who are the players within it, what is happening, and who are the people that I could perhaps talk to if I want to find out more about this market. But it's very limited in terms of what this can really tell you, because I've not listed the limitations here, but the big limitation is that any pre-existing information really tells you about the past. It doesn't tell you about a future that has your innovation in it. It can't, because your innovation is not yet known to the rest of the world. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an innovation. So almost by definition, secondary market research will tell you about the past and perhaps the present, and maybe there's some speculation about the future, but it's very limited in what it can tell you about what the future will look like once you introduce your innovation into the market. To achieve that, what you need to do is talk to people who are already in the market, share your vision with them, and see what comes back. Find out whether they think it might fly, whether it solves a real problem, in what form it should perhaps be offered to the market. And those kind of people are the ones listed here: potential future customers and users, even potential competitors. They may turn out to become partners, you never know. Don't be too shy about talking to potential competitors. You don't necessarily have to give them the secret of how it works. You can just say, I have an innovation that I think will have these functional characteristics. Is that of interest to someone? Trade bodies can give you overviews of what is happening in markets. They can help you to make contacts. Market experts, there are often people who are recognized as experts in particular markets that you can contact. And you can tell them that you've got some exciting information to share about innovation that you'd like to introduce into the market, and just see what comes back. It's very important to have an open discussion with them. If you want to get a bit of experience doing this kind of work, let me give a plug for Amy here. Why don't you contact Amy and see if you can participate in an iTeams project? It's a wonderful initiative in which students actually go through this experience of investigating the market potential of a new innovation. To do this market research, you can't simply do a survey, because there is still so much that is unknown, and you need to be able to follow up the surprising answers that you're quite likely to get in your first interactions with the market. So it's important to set up discussions, to set up interviews where you're able to follow through any surprising answers, follow up and see what they say. One of the most interesting initial answers you can get is actually the word no. If you ask whether people would be interested in this kind of innovation that you have in mind, and they say no, that's your cue for finding out, why are they saying this? What am I misunderstanding here? What's going on in this market that I'm not seeing? So follow up the answers is very important. And you use each of these interviews to then get more interviews. End an interview always by asking, who else should I be talking to, so that I get a better feel for what's going on in this market and whether my innovation will be welcome and how I can modify it, and see if you can get referrals and introductions from that. And then as you have these kind of discussions, not just with people with a technical background, but business people, they will increasingly want you to show what you've got in terms of functionality, something that works, that they can get their head around, that they can perhaps pick up and play with. So it's helpful if you can, in the meantime, develop working demonstrators and prototypes and test those and show that they can work in reality. While you're doing all this, you'll be gathering a lot of information about the market, about what your innovation might do and how you might want to take it forward into the market. And that can get quite confusing. So again, in the spirit of this is not rocket science, we would generally advocate using a simple analysis method like this kind of radargram, to get a grip on what you should be doing and on whether the opportunity that you're looking at is actually an attractive one or not. And to create these radargrams, which is really easy, you can do it in any spreadsheet app. You basically divide all this mass of information that you've gathered into a number of specific factors that you feel are important to consider. And we've given you an example here with 8 factors. This is not necessarily a definitive version that works under all circumstances. You can modify it if you want. But once you've split it into a set of factors, you can then think about each of those individually. Think about how strong is my proposition in this particular respect. Allocate a score to it. Put these scores into this diagram, and you've got something that you can begin to work with. To help with the scoring, you can have guidelines such as these. These, again, it's just an example of how we did it at one point in time, with 2 pages of guidelines here that help you to score. And you then get diagrams such as this. And in a first order, relatively simple interpretation of this method, you can see how the method or how the proposition in the top diagram is more attractive than the one in the bottom diagram, because it scores quite highly on every respect, whereas the one in the bottom diagram has some significant weaknesses in there. It can help you to not only make that kind of decision if, let's say, you had 2 different technologies that you want to commercialize and you've done your work on both of them. You've created these diagrams. Which one are you going to progress with? Probably the one at the top, because it seems to be much more ready to be taken forward than the one at the bottom. It can also be applied if you have one solution but different markets, different applications for that one technology in different markets or market segments. Again, you might create multiple diagrams like this and use that to help you decide which one to take forward or which one to take forward first. It can also help you if you decide that you do want to proceed with an opportunity such as the one in the bottom diagram. It helps you to focus your thinking and your efforts onto the weak points. In this case, you might then say, well, can we make this opportunity stronger by working on our team, perhaps putting a stronger team together so that we can score higher on that, and even working on our market size. You might think, well, I can't change the market size, but you may well be able to by modifying your innovation so that it becomes attractive to a bigger market. And so there are ways and means of increasing your score, and that can be a helpful way of directing your activities rather than sitting back being all bewildered by the complexity of the situation. So the simple interpretation is that you're trying to pump up the balloon, basically. You're trying to create a diagram that has high scores everywhere. Now, that is only a very simple interpretation, because it assumes that it's important to score as highly as possible in every aspect of this. And that's quite often not the case. Quite often, some of these aspects are more important than others. So it is vital that you look at these things intelligently and you ask yourself the question, how important is it that we have, say, a 3 instead of a 5 here? So it's very important to do that. There is some quite in-depth work has been done by a couple of guys in Cambridge who have essentially used this method in a more sophisticated way by looking at lots of different types of technology-enabled businesses in different sectors, in different markets, and at different stages of development. And they've developed a whole system whereby you could have these kind of diagrams with baselines within them. Let's say for a agri-tech business at a intermediate stage of development, this is the baseline you should aim for. It's not all 5s. In some cases, you can accept a 2 or a 3. For other aspects, you have to have a 5. So there are more sophisticated ways of dealing with this. But even in this simple form, it can help you through your thinking process. And it can help you to have more meaningful discussions with other people about your opportunity, because it allows you to focus on specific aspects of the business and to compare scores with other people, and then to discuss why they're coming up perhaps with different scores. It can be very valuable. If you think all that is just too much for you and you don't really want to do this anymore, you could of course give up. It's kind of a shame, but it's still an interesting process to go through. But there are alternatives to giving up. One thing that's very important to bear in mind is that most inventions that come out of universities, that come out of research, are actually licensed to existing companies as an alternative to using that invention in order to create a new company. In most cases, creating a new company will be very risky, very difficult, particularly if there are strong competitors already in the market that will try to push you out if you enter that market as a newcomer. Starting a new business, developing the technology, getting it into the market, paying for all the costs along the way, generally means there's quite a lot of money required. There's quite a high risk involved in all of this. The risk of failure is high. The reward might be very high, but the risk of failure is high. And really, starting a new business is only applied generally in a small minority of cases. Most opportunities are licensed out to existing companies. What it means is you protect the knowledge, you try to protect it with a patent if you can, and you then find existing companies that might want to adopt the knowledge that you've got, the technology that you've got, and they then do the further development and the integration and the market introduction. And in return, once they start selling the product or the system or the service, you get a slice of the income coming from it. It's not a risk-free method of doing it. You have to know what you're doing. It's good to get advice and not just try to do this by yourself, because there are things that can go wrong. But overall, it is a lower risk, but also lower reward way of doing it. The other thing is, of course, you may have a clever technology idea, you may be uncertain about whether you want to take it forward, but you might know some other people who are dying to start a new business, who are looking for something to build it on, and who would love to take your technology forward. So look around, do your networking, see if there are other people out there who want to take your idea forward. You can still do a deal with them where you get some of the ultimate outcomes. So whatever you do, it's actually a really interesting and valuable learning experience going through all of this. Even if it fails, if you've learned from it, it places you in a stronger position, perhaps to try again with a new idea, or even just to go and work for a business with a better understanding of how business works and what makes it successful. Then that's a positive outcome. So don't be put off too quickly. I'll talk a little bit about money. Could easily spend a half a day on this, so I'll try to summarize the main points. And first and foremost, my main point is don't do what that guy does, which is to chase after money just because it's there. The first thing you need to do if you're a new entrepreneur is try to minimize your expenditure. So don't think that you immediately need to rent premises somewhere expensive and to spend lots of money on equipment and all that kind of stuff. Do the minimum, beg, borrow and steal, rent rather than buy to keep the amounts of money that you need as low as possible. Even if you have to go for external finance, those who provide the finance will appreciate the fact that you have tried to minimize your costs, because they don't want to have to put any more money in than they absolutely need to for you to get to your commercial success. It's very tempting to chase after money just because the money's there, but there are serious disadvantages to doing that, and you need to balance it very carefully. Overall, I would say the majority of new technology-enabled ventures actually do what is called a soft start. They use their own money, they minimize their costs, they perhaps sell some of their time on a consultancy basis or a contract research basis while developing their bright new idea in their home garage, rather than get money from outside sources. Big cons are, it just takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort to get money from any source, and really it could distract you from your core task, which is to get to your customer with a product that that customer will buy. That should be your razor sharp focus. If raising finance is needed in order to get you there, then by all means do it. If it's not essential, then you're probably better off not trying to raise the finance, but get going straight ahead. So you've got to keep asking yourself that question whenever you see some money on the horizon. Is it necessary for me to get this money to get to the point where I have a product that I can sell to a customer that wants to buy it? If it's not necessary, don't chase after the money just because it's there. If you do want to go after money, forget about the banks. Bank funding is not an option for technology-enabled ventures. Coming back to the point I made about risk, banks do not like risk. They are the kind of organizations that will lend you an umbrella until it rains, then they want it back. They will only put money in really quite low risk ventures, so that yes, the chip shops know the agri-tech businesses. Quite often you hear people talk about friends and family rounds, which can be great. Just be careful, because you may be very enthusiastic about your idea, the wonderful business you're going to create, the success you're going to achieve, that you want to share with your friends and family. And why wouldn't you want to share your success? But what about if it fails? And what about if you've lost all the money that they gave you? Think very carefully before you accept money from people that you have close relationships with. Crowdfunding may sound like a wonderful option, but it's pretty limited in terms of what it can cover. It tends to work best with consumer products that speak to the imagination, where you can encourage a large number of individuals to part with small amounts of money and then have funding available to make it happen. It tends to be a lot harder. There are crowdfunding platforms available for technology-enabled ventures and business-to-business ventures. It can work, but it is no easier to get it than it is from a venture capital fund or a business angel or grant funding. All of it takes a very significant amount of preparation, of work, of time, of effort. Don't underestimate it. Equity funding is the thing that very many early stage entrepreneurs think they need to turn to automatically, but it is only suitable in a small minority of cases, and there are big risks associated with it. For those who don't know, equity funding means that you get money in return for a shareholding in your business. It's money that you won't need to pay back because it's not a loan. You can use it up. Hopefully your business becomes successful, the shares become worth more money, and the investor can ultimately sell their shares, and that's their financial return. But as soon as you hand over shares in your venture, you no longer have full control over the venture. In fact, in all likelihood, the degree of control that you then have over the future of your venture is so low that the investor may well be able to make decisions that you don't like, but they can make. They may well push you out of the business at some point if they feel that you are not the right person to lead it. They may well decide at some point that the business needs to be sold, even though you don't like that. So be very careful about this. You're handing over, in most cases, a significant level of control over your venture if you accept equity finance. Grant funding is often seen as a free and easy option. And there is a lot to be said for, if you have a technology idea, for using grant funding to maximum effect. Just don't underestimate the effort it takes to get the grant funding, the risk that you will put all that effort in and you still don't get the grant, the degree to which you often have to postpone the next stage because you're waiting for the grant decision to be made. It can slow you down significantly. Having said that, if you are still in academia and there are academic grants available to continue maybe some of the early lab work and take it to a demonstrator stage, then by all means look at getting such grants. There are accelerators and business plan competitions. If you're serious about taking this out of the lab into a business venture, you do well to take a look at the availability of those initiatives. If you're going for the more business-focused grants from the likes of Innovate UK, first and foremost, look for the ones that have a thematic focus that suits your particular objectives well. So in your case, agri-tech-focused grants are the first ones to look for, rather than the general purpose grants, because with the general purpose ones, you'll be competing against a lot of different technology-enabled ideas, some of which will be very sexy in the eyes of the funding provider. You may have a big struggle, whereas if it's a narrowly defined grant and it fits well with what you're trying to do, your chance of success is likely to be higher. If there are no thematically focused grants you can get, you may want to go to Innovate UK's SMART grant, but see if you can first do one of their feasibility studies, which is about doing this market research and this early demonstration that your technology can work in practice. It's very helpful to do that before you go for the more, the larger industrial research type grants and prototype development. I would stay away from the European funding, not for any ideological reasons, but because international grant funding is by its nature much more complex. It requires collaboration, multinational collaboration. You'll be a tiny junior partner in a much bigger project. You'll have much less scope to influence it. The timescales are much longer, the success levels are much lower. So it's not one that I would generally go for. There are exceptions, but as a general rule, try and stay away from it. Here are a few links that will be on the slides that will make available. You can follow those through. Some of them are very much funding related. Some of them are broader in their scope. They can support the development of agri-tech businesses in other ways as well. So take a look when you get the slides. And just finally, a few quick secrets of success really for any type of fundraising, not just grants. It's really, if you've got this, what this sentence tells you here, if you have a strong commercial case, good understanding of the market, the customers, good plan, technology that works, then there's money to be made by selling whatever you've come up with. And if there's money to be made, there will be people willing to invest in that because they can then make money from it. So that is the way to put yourself in a position where raising funding becomes a whole lot easier. It's very important that you don't just go to someone and say, please give me some money. You've got to understand who you're dealing with, what their objectives in life are, what their track record is of funding similar ventures, and make sure that you only proceed if there is a good match between you and the funding provider. Because you're not just going to get the money, you're starting a relationship, and that relationship has to work. And for that, you have to know them. And you have to make it very clear how they will benefit if they give you money. It's not just about you benefiting from the money, it's about how they will then ultimately benefit because they gave you this money. And do make sure that if you do fundraising, try and get a decent amount, because otherwise fundraising becomes a full-time job. By the time you've received the first amount, if it's too small, you'll have used it up too quickly, you'll very quickly be back trying to raise more funding. So try and get a decent chunk of money that will get you to a commercially meaningful point where perhaps you can then start going into the market as early as possible. Right, I don't know how I've done for time. I think we're more or less on time. Brian, do you want to carry on straight away, or shall we briefly pause for some questions?
Yeah, I was going to say the same to you. I mean, it might make sense, while it's kind of fresh in everyone's mind, for you to do a bit of Q&A on your session. Are you staying around to the end anyway, or
yep,
are you
going to? I will.
Okay.
I will. So we could do Q&A at the end, whatever you.
No, we'll do a bit of both.
Are there any urgent questions?
Been a few comments on chat. I'm not sure necessarily questions as such. How much money is generally too much? Never too much.
No, I don't think it's. I don't think you're unlikely to raise too much. I would have thought. There's probably a bigger risk of raising too little.
Yeah. Although actually, maybe I will quick dive in on that with something I was going to mention a little bit later, which is that I've noticed recently that there's been a big uptick in the size of VC rounds for very kind of interesting leading edge technology that the VCs are interested in investing in. And they seem to be investing in the order of sort of 30, 40, even 50 million pounds relatively early in a company's life cycle. The only danger with that, and this is where the too much money might come in, is that obviously that creates some huge expectations for the future success of the business. And of course, if this doesn't start to materialize, then you're dealing with investors that are disappointed. And if you need more money to continue, potential risk of a down round where the valuation reduces on those very frothy, highly enthusiastic early investments. So to a certain extent, there can be too much money, but probably better to worry about not enough rather than too much, I think.
Yeah. And the general question, how much, depends very much on what kind of innovation you're working on. Whether it's something more software or hardware or something that requires regulatory approval, those kind of things can vary enormously how much money is needed. I would say, as a general rule, try to make sure you get enough money to get to a meaningful milestone that actually means something, and that will then unlock interest from other parties that in the earlier stages weren't interested yet because it's too early, too risky. So get to a meaningful point where you have some kind of demonstrator that makes a difference, even if it's not the end product yet. Any more questions at this point? Or are you all dying to hear from Brian? Of course you are.
All right, let's do a switch over. So, no, there we go.
Hang on.
Yeah, should the milestones be clear at the start? I think, yeah, absolutely.
It's very important to have a plan that has clear milestones in it. But again, reality may intervene, and you may have to revisit that and change them if that, because, for example, the technology doesn't work as well as you thought, or works better than you thought, or you've discovered new market information, a competitor has come in and does something. And so you always have to be prepared to change your plans if circumstances give you good reason to do so. But that's no excuse not to have a plan. You should have a plan with some clear milestones that you're aiming for.
I think just to add to that, when you create these milestones, you don't necessarily have to answer all the questions up front. You don't necessarily need to be able to plot the whole journey. The key thing is to plot the journey for a realistic period of time and match that to the amount of funding that you've asked for, so that there's some clear development within the ask.
Yes, and you can still have a vision for what happens after that, but with a degree of uncertainty in it. I think you need to speak to your technology transfer office if there are relationships with an industrial partner to be set up. It depends a bit what you mean by a relationship with an industrial partner.
I'm going to touch on that very briefly in my part, Alex. So maybe
Okay.
I'll sort of come back a little bit on that and see
All right.
if we can tease it out and maybe pick
Sure.
that up again at the end.
Yeah. So shall I stop sharing?
Yeah, let's do a switch now. So if you want to
stop sharing. Right.
let me see if I can get mine to work. Right, I think we're in business.
Yeah, just do a full screen.
There we go. Right, okay, so let me take over from Alex. So thanks, Alex, for that very useful kind of view as to how to get your innovation forward to a point where it is ready to be commercialized. I will cover some of the things that Alex has addressed already, but I'll try and put a different spin on those and provide a different angle. So really, my focus is more about actually setting up a venture and again finding the sources of funding for that. Let me just give you a quick overview of the focus for my part of the session. So I want to talk briefly about commercialization models and then look at some theories around growth trajectories. So how do you actually grow a business? Then I'll look at some quite nuts and bolts kind of logistical things around the startup process itself. Come back a little bit on the funding side, and then just finish off with a look at some of the kind of focus points, really referring back to this topic around milestones and where a business should be and what it should be looking for moving forward. So the first thing I wanted to emphasize, and this really goes back to the point that Alex was making earlier, is that starting up a company isn't the only option when you move forward. So there are really three key models that you can look at, one of which is the kind of consultancy or service-based model. So rather than trying to create a product, what you're really doing is transferring your knowledge and experience and developing the innovation into the market in that sense. The second one is licensing or potentially industrial collaboration, which goes back to the question in the chat a minute ago. So, licensing is very common, particularly in a university context, and provides a relatively low risk way and low resource way to get innovative ideas out into the marketplace. And a variant on that would perhaps be industrial collaboration, which in some ways relates a little bit to the consultancy service model, but also could be defined slightly differently around perhaps joint development of innovations and technology that could be exploited through some kind of licensing scheme with industrial partners. And then really the last option is the startup or spin out option. And certainly in Cambridge, if you look at the commercialization opportunities through the Technology Transfer Office, Cambridge Enterprise, typically in a year you might be looking at 2 to 3 spin outs, maybe 5 on a good year, compared to licensing agreements, which will be in the tens, if not hundreds, in a particular year. So you have to see the startup and spin out option as being really less common and one that needs to be thought about really carefully. And then the last point on this is really just to talk about this, what's the difference between a startup and a spin out? And I guess really the key thing is that a spin out is, for example, a company that comes out of a university or perhaps out of an industrial company, and a new business is created, whereas a startup tends to be much more independent. So it's the founders themselves that are developing the innovation or the intellectual property. So we've talked about the different models that we could use for commercialization. Now let's have a look at the legal frameworks. And again, it's very tempting to think that a startup only has one legal type, and that's the only way to create a business. And we'll just step through these one at a time. So depending on the nature of your business, particularly if you decided to take the more consultancy or service-driven model, there's no reason why you couldn't go for a self-employed or sole trader basis, which may mean that you don't even need to create a company at all. So you're really just focused on reporting your earnings through the annual return to the tax office, to HMRC. Next along the line is really partnerships, and there's a new form of partnership called a limited liability partnership. Essentially, partnerships are where the liability resides with the partners. So that means that if there's any losses incurred or obligations or debts, then that is an individual responsibility of the individuals that have formed that partnership. So there's in a way, a higher level of risk in some ways. And then the last version is the limited company, what we tend to think of with commercialization through a business context. And the key point here is that the liability is limited by the value of the shares in the company. So it takes away that individual liability that you would see in a self-employed or a partnership basis. But even within that context of a limited company, there are various formats. So the traditional one that people tend to think of, particularly in technology and sort of VC funded environment, is the for-profit business. But there are other formats. So there's social enterprises, and essentially these are very similar to a standard limited liability company focused on profit. But the main thing is that the social enterprise will define its social impact mission, and very often it will be returning funds for use by the business or for the community it serves, rather than for the profit of shareholders. And then the last two variations are either setting up as a charity, or as the charity gets more complex, perhaps setting up as a charitable incorporated organization, or there's community interest companies. And both of those have quite specific requirements in terms of how the vision and mission of the company is established before it's set up. So the key thing here is to really drive the legal framework that you use based around the focus and vision of the business that you're trying to create. So is it a profit, for profit business, or are you trying to achieve social impact, where perhaps some of these other formations may be a better option for you? Let's have a little look at the startup journey now. There's a lot of focus now, a lot of talk about startups and venture capital backed companies, and it's very much a theme that's understood now. And there tends to be a rather simplistic view of how the process works. So it's very linear. There's a view that the only direction is up, and that it's a straightforward progressive journey. And you can see here that we've got pre-startup, startup and growth, going from the ideation phase through to an established business. So it feels that it's almost inevitable that once you start a company that it's going to be successful, and it's just a matter of time for that to happen. And actually the timescales may be relatively short and straightforward. So, you know, you'd be looking to turn a profit perhaps by year 2 or 3 and scale up dramatically by year 5. So that very simplistic view is what tends to drive people to think that starting a business is the right way to go. One thing I like to pick up on this slide is you'll notice that we have a pre-startup phase. So essentially the company is established at point 0, but we've also got -1 and -2, where it's all about determining the vision and the mission. It's creating this ideation process and the concept of the innovation that you're trying to develop. And the concept here is that you do that before the startup phase. And really the thinking behind this is that once you get into creating a company, you're starting to formalize and legalize the process, then you start to get into costs and complexities that are perhaps better delayed somewhat. So really make sure that you're very clear about the concept of the innovation, who you're targeting at, doing some of the work that Alex talked about earlier before you make that leap into creating the company. So I talked a little bit about the timescales there. This is some work from a book called Camels, Tigers and Unicorns, which looks at the growth of technology-based companies. And you can see on this slide, it gives a breakdown of the typical time frame for companies to grow and reach scale. And you can see that, first of all, there's quite a lot of variation, but also in some businesses, it can be quite long periods of time. So for example, aerospace engineering, we're looking at a period of 12 years. And even some of the faster growth companies, you know, average for software companies is something like 5 to 6 years. The financial services very similar. The figure here is talked about as being maximum customers, and I'll come back to that in another slide in a minute. But the key point really from this slide is the reality of the startup journey, that it can take a lot longer than you anticipate at the beginning. So really try to make sure that you're committed to that type of engagement before you start, before you take that leap from -2 and -1 into incorporating the company and setting up. So another view of the commercialization journey is about how the product gains traction with the marketplace. And this is really moving on from some of the points that Alex was making earlier about determining the product market fit. And there was a concept that was developed by Geoffrey Moore around about 20 years ago, I think, which talked about the chasm. And the key concept here was that, particularly when we're talking about technology and technology-based and innovative businesses, that there's a challenging point between being able to gain traction with the early adopters. So it talks here about innovators and early adopters. So the techies are the ones that tend to jump in and buy technologies at a very early stage. And early adopters, the visionaries that can see the attraction of new technologies. And this will be true whether it's a consumer product or whether it's a business-to-business product. There will be businesses that are much more open to innovation and will come in and buy products early on, perhaps when the true value is still a little bit unproven. And then the challenge is how do you get from that visionary early adopter innovative type of customer to the mainstream? And what Geoffrey Moore observed was that with a lot of technologies, it just doesn't make it across that gap, across that chasm. So the market is really too niche, and it's not possible to get to these pragmatists, the early majority, the people that bit more conservative, they're not prepared to dive in early, but you know, they're still relatively fast coming into the market. And then later on with the product life cycle, it's all about grabbing the late majority and the laggards, the people that really take on technology quite late on. So that will be one of the challenges with a startup company, is how to get beyond that early phase into the scale up phase and the growth phase that was shown in that early diagram about company growth. Now let's step back to another way of looking at this journey, and this is really where I'm going to explain a little bit more about this concept of Cmax, or the maximum number of customers. So if you recollect from the chart about the growth phase of companies in different industries, it talked about the time to reach Cmax. So Cmax is the maximum number of customers that a company or a technology is likely to achieve over its lifetime. Now you might be thinking, well, how does that work? I mean, surely some innovations, some businesses will have a much smaller number of customers than another type of business. And of course that's true, but Cmax is relevant to whatever industry you're looking at. So let's take the example of the aerospace industry. So a company like Boeing or Airbus, for example, their maximum number of customers might be in the hundreds, 500, 1,000. How many airlines are there in the world? So their maximum number of customers might be 1,000. On the other hand, if you looked at a social media business, then Cmax might be in the hundreds of millions or even the billions. So companies like Facebook or Airbnb or Uber, their Cmax number will be massively bigger. But again, what we're looking at is the maximum number of customers that you can acquire for your innovation or technology. And more importantly, and this is what this slide is all about, how long does it take you to get there? So at the bottom of this graph, we've got Tmax, and Tmax is the time it takes you to acquire that total number of customers. And we saw that there was a range between sort of 5-6 years for some and 12 for others. But more importantly with this chart is that we start to see that there are several points at which it may be difficult for a company or very challenging to move on to the next phase of growth. And this comes from a framework which is called the Triple Chasm Framework, developed by Uday Padkar and Shrivart Deokarnam, a couple of Cambridge academics. And as Alex mentioned earlier, it was based on research on about 3,000 companies, of which 300 were determined as being successful companies. And through that research, they identified that there were actually 3 points at which this growth phase can be quite challenging. So chasm 3 really equates to Geoffrey Moore's chasm, but there are a couple of earlier phases, chasm 1 and chasm 2, that occur before that and make it quite challenging to reach the next level of customer acquisition. And the other thing that you'll see from this slide, so on the left hand, we've got a version which is in log scale. And the reason for that is if you look at the linear scale on the right, it's really almost halfway along that customer acquisition growth curve before there's any sensible uptick in the number of companies or customers that you've acquired. So Two key points here. One is that these things take a lot longer than anyone anticipates, but also early on in this growth process, the increase in customer acquisition and therefore revenues is a lot lower and a lot slower than people would imagine. Let's have a look at, assume that we've decided to go down this commercialization route of creating a company. What's the key focus area at the beginning, the key priority? And for me and for Hermann Hauser, who's quoted here, it's all about having the right team. So Hermann Hauser was quoted back in 2016 as saying that an A team with C technology will win over a C team with A technology every time. And the reason for that is that if you've got the right team, even if there are technological issues to overcome, even if the technology isn't quite perfect at the beginning of the journey, with the right team, you can overcome those problems and work through to a successful outcome. So Hermann, having had a successful career in technology entrepreneurship, created his own venture capital firm called Amadeus Capital Partners. And really this was talking about his view of investing in those technology companies. So what does that mean for you as founders of a company? So I think the key thing is to make sure that you focus on developing the right core founder team at the beginning of the process. And in terms of numbers, you really want to be looking at a team that ideally has 3 people in it. From an investment point of view, the range is probably 2 to 4 people. Less than 2, which obviously clearly means 1 person. The challenge there is that the business is too dependent on 1 person, so there's too high a level of risk there. But more importantly, it's really challenging for an individual to grow a business on their own. You need counteractive views, you need different skill sets to be able to really take a technology forward and make it successful. At the early stage, actually having too many founders can be challenging as well. Once you get beyond 4, if you've got a founding team of 5, 6 or 7 people, then it really becomes too complex to get the vision and mission created and agreed to deal with some of those fundamental points at the early stage of business growth. So an ideal combination would be around about 3 people with complementary skill sets. So you'd want the creative person, you would want the pragmatist, you want someone with business skills to be able to take the concept forward. So really focus on getting that team right at the very beginning. So let's assume that you've decided to go down this startup route. You're at ground zero, you've got your team in place, and it's time for incorporation. So for me personally, I've literally just gone through this process about 10, 14 days ago with a new startup that I'm involved with, and this is exactly the process that I've been through over the last few weeks and months. So again, going back to building the team, one of the key things is to have some kind of founders agreement in place before you even start to think about incorporation. So this is bringing together, ideally in a written format, so that you can reflect on it and have something to refer back to, which talks about how the members of the team are going to work together. Now, the founders agreement could be pre-incorporation, and that may well turn into what becomes a shareholders agreement as part of the legal documentation for the company once it's founded. What's happening now, actually, there used to be a phase probably 10, 15, 20 years ago where a shareholders agreement would be part of the legal documentation for the startup company. what seems to be occurring now is that actually a lot of the terms within the shareholders agreement are actually incorporated into the articles of association of the business, and probably some kind of employment agreement for the founders. And that employment agreement could be there even if you're not actually being paid at the early phase. Next thing is to work out the equity split. So, you know, if it's a team of 3 founders, quite likely it'll be a third each, but maybe that's not the case. Maybe there's a sense amongst the founders that one person brings more to the party, or perhaps you have a couple of early founders who manage to inspire someone else to come in and join, and perhaps the equity split will be a bit different. But of course, when you found the company, you've got to put in the amount of equity, the amount of shares that are applied to each of the shareholders. So you need to have that equity split put in place. Then, and this may sound a bit trivial, you have to have a company name, because when you incorporate, it has to have a company name. So first of all, you need to make sure that the name is available. But of course, it then becomes a little bit more complex than that, because as you create the company name, that's the start of your branding process. And that name is going to carry with you for some time. So it's a good idea to have a brainstorming session very early on, even though you might think that that seems like a trivial thing to do, to come up with an interesting company name, one that you can build some branding on. And of course, at the same time, make sure that you do a search for domain names, because there's no point having a wonderful company name if you can't get the domain name for it and start to publicize your company that way. So let's assume that you've got the founders agreement, the equity split, the company name in place. Then you're ready to go. It's time to incorporate. And the good news is that in the UK, the process is very, very simple. Assuming that you've done all these phases, first of all, incorporation can be done in something like 10 to 15 minutes, maybe half an hour maximum. And in fact, the price to do this has dropped. When I incorporated a previous company about 6 years ago, I think it was £18 to incorporate. And now it's even less. It's dropped down to £12. So that's relatively straightforward. Once you've done that, then it's a case of getting a bank account in place so that you can actually start to deal with the funds that you're going to need to operate the business. And again, there's some good news here. It used to be quite complex with the big banks, you know, people like HSBC and Barclays. Always seemed to be a long and tedious process to get a bank account in place. Whereas nowadays, with the new form of digital banks, it's a lot more straightforward, very easy to do, very easy to set up. Minimal charges and minimal cost of running the bank account. So you've got people like Tide and Starling and so forth. And interestingly, Wise, which is the kind of international bank account, are now pushing to be a new generation digital bank. So the company we set up just a couple of weeks ago, we're using Wise as the bank account. Very easy to set up and easy to operate. So you've set your business up, you're all ready to go, you're keen and mean, and off you go. So let's talk about some funding opportunities and just pick up a little bit on the points that Alex made, and also look at the phases of doing that. So I think the key funding source is the kind of lean startup bootstrap mentality. So try to minimize the need for funding in the first place. So try and see how long a path, a trajectory you can run without any funding at all. Next one is what typically is called the 3 F's. So that's fools, friends, and family. Alex has already made the point about the friends and family side, and I've been through this on both sides. both in terms of getting family investing in companies that I've set up, but also investing in companies set up by family. And it can be quite challenging. There are big risks there. You know, there's a chance that you might end up souring relationships with friends and family. So think very carefully about that. Fools, great if you can find them. But there's actually a fourth F, which used to be called our flexible friend, so the credit card. I often get told off for introducing that one in a university environment because it's a little bit far on the risk spectrum, but credit cards can be quite a good way to fund a business in the short term. It just overcomes some of those very early challenging times. Alex has talked a fair amount already about grants and some of the opportunities there. The only thing I wanted to add there is that grants aren't only available for the key activity, you know, the innovation development work, things like the SMART awards from Innovation UK. But they are available for other things. So, for example, with the company I've just set up, we're looking at a grant from the Royal Society of Chemistry for outreach. And that may help to fund some of the early marketing collateral that we need, because we'll be creating resources to educate the public into some of the technology that we're developing. And that can obviously be reused for publicizing the company on its website, or perhaps to use with investors to explain the technology as part of a pitch. The next form of funding, both Alex and I feel is one that's absolutely critical. It's one that should be focused on from day one. It's also a funding source that reduces your need for external funding, such as venture capital or angel investment. So try and find ways to get money in from potential customers as early as possible. Not only does that give you some early funding, but it also means that you're getting faster and closer to this acquisition of customers and providing the traction that's an important part of the growth and funding process. There are a lot of incubator and accelerator programs around now. As with any form of funding or grant funding, make sure that you look at ones that are well suited to the sector that you're in. These incubator and accelerator programs often come with some limited initial investment, might be £50,000, 75, £100,000, often with a set sum for a set amount of equity. It might be 5, 7.5% or 10% of the business. So it overcomes some of the valuation issues that can be a challenge if you move on to the next two types of funding, which are angel funding or crowdsourcing, or venture capital funding. Now, angel funding tends to be a good transition between some of the earlier types of funding that we've looked at and mainstream venture capital funding. One of the advantages with angel funding is often angel investors, although they're going to be looking for a return, are also motivated to get involved from a different perspective. So they're interested in perhaps getting involved in more of a mentoring basis. They're often prepared to work with much earlier stage companies. So angel funding, and we've got several examples in Cambridge, such as Cambridge Business Angels, can really provide that transition to venture capital funding. Once we move into mainstream venture capital funding, though, we need to be thinking really carefully as to whether we're ready to make that transition. And it goes back to the slide that I showed you earlier with that point zero. Once you jump on that venture capital grindstone, then the pressure is really on. you need to make sure that you've got a clear view of what the milestones are. You've got a clear view of how you're going to achieve those. Because if you don't deliver on those milestones that you've set, then venture capital investors are going to be looking very carefully at what they've invested in. And bear in mind that venture capital funds are what are called typically closed-end funds. So they have to get a return for their investors in a very short period of time, really, typically within a 3 to 5 year time frame. So you need to make sure that you're ready to make that return quite quickly. And then let me finish off with a point on focus. So, you know, we've been talking about milestones and the stages of growth. This slide reverts back to what I was talking about with the different chasms, chasm 1, 2, and 3. Quite a complex slide, but you'll see from the parts highlighted in red that as your business goes through different phases of growth, you're going to be focusing on different things. So let's take pre-chasm 1, so that's the left-hand side of the slide. If you look at the red lines there, very much focus on things like technology development and what's called contingent deployment. So what else do you need to do to get your technology into the marketplace? Things like IP management and framing the value proposition. So those are the early focus areas for a business before chasm 1. And those will be very different to those between chasm 2 and chasm 3 as you're starting to scale the business and really gain traction with customers. And the focus there becomes much more about customer definition, really being precise about who your customers are, focusing on distribution, marketing, and sales, commercialization strategy, and very importantly, talent, leadership, and culture. So it's about building out the team and being able to get that vision and mission communicated to the rest of the company, the rest of the team. So you'll need to start thinking about what are the key priorities at different phases of company growth. So Alex and I think, have probably done a pretty good job of making you wonder whether it's really worth taking the leap of faith into the company startup mode. But on the bright side, there's some real positives. It can be a huge amount of fun creating and growing a company, get a huge sense of fulfillment from it. Hopefully along the lines, you may be able to make a fortune and perhaps even become famous. A number of very high profile entrepreneurs out there. So maybe you have that as one of your objectives as well. So that's the end of my presentation. We've got a little bit of time left for Q&A. So let me just stop sharing, and hopefully we can see if there's any questions that have come in on the chat. Or presumably, April, we're actually able to get questions asked through Zoom. I guess we're in that mode of Zoom.
Yeah, if anyone wants to actually ask a question verbally, then just pop up your hand and
yeah. Either do a real hand or you can pop it up using reactions, and we'll take your questions. Stunned silence. Everyone's thinking, do I really want to go? Do I really want to do this?
You could use the Q&A.
Yeah, use a Q&A, whichever you feel comfortable with.
There's no Q&A one. I think there's a chat one.
Just the chat, yeah.
The chat one is fine. We're kind of at the end of time, April, but I'm certainly happy to stick around for a couple more minutes if there are questions, and I'm sure Alex is happy to as well. So got a bit of time if you want to think about any questions you've got. Or you can always contact us afterwards.
Yeah.
If you want. Yeah, not a problem. And I was going to say, just to let everyone know that I'll be distributing the recording and the slides via email, so everyone can get those after as well, if there's anything you want to recap on. And I'm sure Brian and Alex will be happy to answer any queries by email, I'm sure. Just putting that out there for you guys.
Yeah.
It's sometimes difficult to think of a question straight after you've had a lot of information, isn't it?
Yeah.
And just before lunch.
Right. Do we have experiences with safe investments? Right. Can someone elaborate a little bit on that question?
Hi, I'm Paul. I asked the question, and I stumbled upon safe investments from a venture capitalist, and they told us that it's a new form of investment that provides guarantees for both sides and is safer. But the conditions seem to be a little bit dubious to me, and I just wanted to know from you whether you have any experience with them.
I personally haven't heard of this particular version. Are there any particular terms that you're thinking of that you're concerned about?
They want to have basically a part of the equity before for the next round, so they buy futures basically, and these futures can be very high, and in this particular point they're about at 25%. And I'm not sure that this is appropriate, and whether safe investments are actually a good option for funders, because we are in a pre-seed round at the moment, and maybe it would be smarter to get the pre-seed money and then go forward with distributing equity in the next round once we have established a little bit more what our actual value is in the market.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've got a couple of responses to that. The first one refers to your latter point, and I think actually that's probably the critical one. We talked about the kind of growth phases and milestones and trying to focus on particular kind of targets for development over the life of the company. And in terms of investment, investors are looking to reduce the risks that Alex talked about by focusing on kind of tangible milestones and phases of business growth. And they'll kind of limit the amount of investment to match that step to the next phase. Now, of course, from the company point of view, from the founder's point of view, that's also a good thing, because as you get closer and closer to the customer, you get more traction. You look at the triple chasm framework with these different chasms. Each of those chasms is a risk phase. So as you get through those chasms, your valuation will increase. And if you try to raise funds too early and too much, then your valuation is suffering because of that. So if you can kind of work through to some useful, tangible milestones at one valuation, then you're kind of keeping your powder dry and allowing yourself not to be kind of captured to a lower valuation. Then in terms of the specific, the safe investments, this isn't a term that I'm particularly familiar with. So I think this must be a relatively new one that's coming on the market. It feels like a bit of a marketing ploy to me, because I think technology investment isn't safe. Working with VC funds has a lot of potential risks to it that Alex talked about, things like, potentially you may lose control of the company, they may try to move you out. And, things like down rounds, which is where, the company valuation drops before the next round, that will have a serious effect on dilution for the founders. They'll find themselves being knocked way back. So this kind of almost like an option on future valuation really feels quite risky to me. It doesn't feel like a safe approach. It feels like a higher risk approach. I don't know what you think, Alex. Have you come across this term at all?
I haven't come across it, but the first thing I thought was, just be careful. How will any future investors look at this? Because they may feel it's an unnecessary complication that they don't want to see, and therefore they may be less inclined to invest. So it may have the net effect of tying you more to this investor. giving you less freedom to go to others. But I don't know the ins and outs of it, so I can't be sure. You just have to make sure you don't just look at this investment deal. Think carefully about what will it mean in the future, using different scenarios.
Yeah. And don't forget, you can always say no. That's the key thing. Don't let yourself be kind of pushed into, oh, we're going to make a decision. You know, there's always other ways around it. You can accept a slightly slower growth rate. You can look at other forms of investment. And you know, there are some friendlier investments within the kind of university context where the valuation point can be delayed through convertible loans, where the loan is converted at the valuation of the first round. So you're not having to work out what the valuation will be in the future. The university seed fund might well say, well, we'll create a loan that's convertible, but at a future concrete round.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, pleasure.
Any more questions? Or is it time for lunch?
An ideal founding team. Yeah, I guess, yes, Stephen, I guess that will be true. I mean, I'm actually thinking about in the startup that I'm involved in now, where we've really got 2 scientists, and as myself, as Alex said at the beginning, I'm not a scientist. I actually have a humanities degree originally, but an MBA, and I've been through sort of technology commercialization. So I'm very much the sales, marketing, funding, finance part of the team. One of the founders is more the creative, innovative, you know, real deep thinking scientist. And the other person who's a scientist is more in terms of the operational development of the science. So it doesn't necessarily need to be an experienced commercial development manager, but it's someone who's got that characteristic of making sure that the blue sky work gets turned into something that can be delivered to the customer. So it's that kind of split, really. So I guess we probably should wrap up now. We've run over a little bit. I hope that's all right, April.
Not a problem. Thank you so much, Brian and Alex, for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been really interesting. Just to let everyone know that the next one will be on the 22nd of November, and we'll be hearing from the founder and CEO of the small robot company. So that'll be an interesting one as well. As I say, the recording and the slides will go out via email, and I'm sure Alex and Brian will be happy to answer any of your questions that you've got. So thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Bye now. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Good luck with everything.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.